Step away from that weapon, sir. Now! The command cut through the afternoon, quiet like a blade. Brandon Cole stood over the seated man, shoulders squared, hand hovering near his radio. He was 28, freshly certified, and convinced that authority came from the uniform he wore. Daniel Morrison, 83, didn't look up. His weathered hands moved with deliberate precision, drawing an oil-soaked cloth along the walnut stock of the rifle resting across his knees. The sun filtered through the oak leaves, catching the worn steel of the barrel. Around the courtyard, residents paused their afternoon routines. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh clutched her gardening gloves. Mr. Thomas Rivera straightened from his rose bushes, trowel forgotten. "Sir? I said step away." Brandon's voice climbed higher. "No firearms in common areas. That's facility policy." Daniel's steel-gray eyes lifted slowly. They held something Brandon couldn't quite name. Not defiance, not submission. Something far older and infinitely calmer. "Just maintaining my equipment, son." His voice was a deep, quiet rumble. "Humidity's hard on the action. I don't care about humidity." Brandon stepped closer, his shadow falling across the old man. "Hand it over. Now. Before we continue, if you've ever been underestimated because of your age or appearance, type honor below. And tell me where you're watching from. This story of Daniel Morrison proves that true strength never fades. I read every comment. The Meadowbrook Assisted Living facility prided itself on tranquility. Manicured lawns, scheduled activities, a dining hall that served dinner at exactly 5:30 p.m. It was a place where the elderly came to live out their final years in comfort and predictable routine. Daniel had been there for 3 years. Most residents knew him as the quiet man in 3G who kept to himself, never complained, and always nodded politely when passing in the halls. Rick Santos, Brandon's partner, stood a few steps back. He was 52, 15 years on the job, and he'd learned that most situations de-escalated if you just gave people a minute to comply. "Brandon," he said quietly, "let's just ask Mr. Morrison to take it back to his room." "No need to..." "No need to what?" Brandon snapped. "Do our job? Follow protocol?" He turned his attention back to Daniel. "Sir, I need to see your resident identification, and I need you to surrender that weapon for safekeeping." Daniel sighed, a sound like wind through canyon walls. He carefully laid the cloth aside and placed the rifle on the stone bench beside him. He reached into his back pocket and produced a worn leather wallet, flipping it open to show his ID card. He held it out. Brandon snatched the wallet from Daniel's hand. The gesture was aggressive, unnecessary. Several residents gasped. Mrs. Walsh took a step forward, then stopped, uncertain. "Daniel Morrison, room 3G, Brandon read aloud, then began rifling through the other compartments. His fingers pulled out a faded cloth patch, frayed at the edges, with an unfamiliar insignia stitched in black thread. "What's this? Some kind of costume jewelry?" He held it up mockingly. "Living in the glory days, Grandpa?" For the first time, something shifted in Daniel's expression. The calm surface remained, but underneath, a current ran cold and deep. "Put that back," he said. His voice had lost its gentle rasp, replaced by something with edges of tempered steel. "Or what?" Brandon challenged, emboldened by the audience of watching residents. He leaned down, squinting at the rifle. "What's this engraving? Operation Silent Watch. We walk unseen. What kind of make-believe club is this?" He reached out and ran his finger along the receiver, smudging the oil Daniel had so carefully applied. It was a violation, a crossing of an invisible line that everyone watching somehow felt, but couldn't name. Daniel's hand shot out and clamped around Brandon's wrist, not violently, not aggressively, but with a grip that was absolutely immovable. The strength in those weathered fingers was impossible, a complete contradiction to his frail appearance. Brandon yelped and tried to pull away. He couldn't. "You're assaulting an officer," he sputtered, his face reddening. "Let go right now or—" "You will not touch this rifle again," Daniel said. His voice was flat, emotionless, which somehow made it more frightening than if he'd shouted. "Do you understand me?" Across the courtyard, Jennifer Matthews had seen enough. She was 34, visiting her grandfather in the memory care wing, cutting through to the parking lot when she noticed the confrontation. Her own father had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. She knew what she was looking at, a sacred object being desecrated, a warrior being disrespected. While Brandon struggled and Rick tried to calm the situation, Jennifer pulled out her phone. She didn't call 911. She didn't call the facility administrator. She scrolled to a contact she'd saved years ago, Major Davis, Public Affairs, Fort Liberty. She'd met him at a Gold Star Families conference. He'd given her his direct line and said, "If you ever see a soldier or veteran being done wrong, you call me, day or night." She'd never thought she'd use it. She pressed call. Major Davis speaking. The voice was crisp, professional. "Major, this is Jennifer Matthews. We met in 2021 at the—" "I remember, Miss Matthews. What's wrong?" "I'm at Meadowbrook Assisted Living in Fayetteville," she said quickly, her voice tight. "Security guards are harassing an elderly veteran. They're trying to confiscate his rifle. He was just maintaining it. One of them is mocking him, grabbed his wallet, put his hands all over the weapon." There was a pause. "Harassment is a serious accusation. Are they being physical?" "One of them is," Jennifer confirmed. "And Major, there's an engraving on the rifle. The guard read it out loud. He said it says, 'Operation Silent Watch.' We walk unseen." The silence on the other end was absolute. Jennifer could hear distant office sounds, but the Major had gone completely still. "Miss Matthews," his voice had changed entirely, stripped of all casual professionalism, "repeat that name for me." "Daniel Morrison, and the engraving, Operation Silent Watch. We walk unseen. Stay on this line. Do not hang up. What's the exact address?" Jennifer rattled it off, her heart hammering. She had the distinct feeling she'd just triggered something enormous. "Keep eyes on Mr. Morrison," Major Davis commanded. "Is he safe right now?" Jennifer peered around a landscaping wall. "The guard is trying to handcuff him. Mr. Morrison isn't letting him. He's just holding on." "Help is coming, Miss Matthews. Faster than you can imagine." She heard a muffled shout on the other end. "Get me Colonel Hartwell. I don't care if he's in a briefing with the base commander. Tell him it's a silent watch emergency." Back at the bench, Brandon had finally broken Daniel's grip by twisting his arm at an awkward angle. He now had zip-tie restraints out, breathing hard. "That's it, old man. You just assaulted a security officer. You're going to spend the night in observation. Maybe they'll find a nice, quiet room for you where you can't hurt anyone." Rick finally stepped forward, placing a hand on Brandon's shoulder. "Brandon, stop. This has gone too far. Let's call the police and let them handle—" "I am handling it!" Brandon shoved Rick's hand away. He turned back to Daniel, restraints ready. "Put your hands behind your back." Daniel remained seated. He looked past Brandon, past the gathering crowd of residents, his gaze fixed on something distant and unseen. His breathing had changed, slower, deeper, controlled. Anyone who'd served would recognize it. Combat breathing. The kind you use to stay calm when everything around you was chaos. Mrs. Walsh couldn't stay silent anymore. "Young man," she called out, her voice shaking with anger, "you should be ashamed of yourself. Mr. Morrison has never caused trouble. He's the kindest soul in this facility. You have no right—" "Ma'am, step back, or I'll have you removed from the common area too," Brandon snapped. Mr. Rivera moved closer to Mrs. Walsh, protective. A small crowd had formed now, 10, maybe 12 residents, all watching with varying expressions of shock and disapproval. In the 3 years Daniel had lived here, he'd helped Mrs. Chen carry her groceries. He'd fixed Mr. Patterson's wheelchair when it jammed. He'd sat with young Billy Thornton, the custodian, and listened when the kid's girlfriend left him. They knew him as gentle, patient, humble. But now they saw something else in the way he held himself, in the absolute stillness of his posture, in the way his eyes tracked Brandon's every movement with tactical precision. Jennifer was still on the phone with Major Davis. She could hear frantic activity on the other end, shouted commands, rapid footsteps, the unmistakable sound of military urgency. "Miss Matthews, I need you to time something for me," the major said. "How long since you first called?" She checked her phone. 4 minutes. All right. In approximately 11 more minutes, you're going to hear helicopters. Do not be alarmed. Keep the other residents calm if you can. What we're sending is not a threat. It's a rescue. A rescue? Jennifer's voice cracked. Who is Daniel Morrison? Someone we should never have lost track of, Major Davis said quietly. Someone who shouldn't be sitting in a retirement home being disrespected by a man who has no concept of what real service looks like. Brandon grabbed Daniel's shoulder, trying to force him to stand. Get up, now. And that's when Daniel finally spoke the words that would change everything. Son, he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with unexpected power. You're making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life. Not because of what you're doing to me, but because of what you're about to learn you did. Brandon laughed. Is that a threat, old man? No, Daniel said simply. It's a fact. And then, faint but growing louder, came the sound. A rhythmic thumping, distant but approaching fast. The sound of helicopter blades cutting through air. The sound started as a whisper, barely audible over the rustling leaves and the murmur of confused residents. But it grew rapidly, exponentially. A deep, rhythmic chopping that resonated in the chest. A sound that didn't belong in this quiet suburban sanctuary. Every head in the courtyard turned skyward. Brandon's hand fell away from Daniel's shoulder. His confident smirk dissolved into confusion. What the hell is that? Rick knew that sound. He'd done a stint as an Army MP 20 years ago. Those are military helicopters, he said quietly. And they're coming here. 2 black aircraft materialized over the tree line, flying low and fast. They weren't the news helicopters that occasionally passed overhead, or the medical transports heading to the regional hospital. These were different, sleek, purposeful, unmarked. They carried the unmistakable aura of military authority. They weren't flying toward Meadowbrook. They were descending on it. They're landing on the lawn, Mrs. Walsh breathed, clutching Mr. Rivera's arm. The helicopters bypassed the designated helipad at the medical center 2 blocks away. They came straight for the facility's great lawn, a pristine stretch of grass that separated the main building from the independent living cottages. The rotor wash hit first, a hurricane blast that tore through the courtyard. Hats flew. Carefully tended flower arrangements scattered. The residents clutched at railings and each other as the wind whipped their clothes. The noise was overwhelming, a physical presence that hammered the senses and made speech impossible. The helicopters didn't touch down. They hovered 10 feet above the grass with breathtaking precision. Side doors slid open. Thick ropes deployed, and then men began descending. They moved with fluid, predatory grace. 6 from each aircraft, 12 total. They wore unmarked gray tactical uniforms, faces obscured by helmets and dark goggles. They carried weapons but held them in low-ready positions. The moment their boots touched grass, they fanned out, creating a secure perimeter with terrifying efficiency. But they ignored everyone. The gaping residents. The frozen security guards. Their sole focus was on the lead helicopter. From that aircraft, a figure emerged, not on a rope. He used a deployed stairway. He was a tall man in his mid-50s, wearing a simple operational uniform with minimal insignia, but he moved with an aura of absolute command that required no decoration. Colonel James Hartwell, commander of 3rd Special Forces Group. He strode across the lawn, grass bending before him. His eyes were locked on one person and one person only. He walked straight through the perimeter his men had formed, directly toward the stone bench where Daniel Morrison sat. Brandon and Rick had backed away involuntarily. The tactical team's presence had reduced them to irrelevance. They looked like children playing dress-up in the face of real authority. Colonel Hartwell stopped 3 feet from Daniel. He didn't look at the cowering guards, didn't acknowledge the stunned crowd. His gaze fell to the rifle resting on the bench. He leaned down slightly, studying the engraving on the receiver. His lips moved as he read the words, Operation Silent Watch. We walk unseen. When he straightened, his combat-hardened face had softened into an expression of pure, unfiltered awe. He brought his hand up to his brow in a salute so sharp, so perfect, it seemed to slice the air itself. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture of a superior officer. It was the salute of a student to a master, of a believer in the presence of something sacred. "Master Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Hartwell's voice rang out, cutting through the helicopter noise. "Colonel James Hartwell, United States Army Special Forces. It is an honor, sir. An absolute honor." Daniel looked up at the colonel. A flicker of recognition crossed his weathered face. He gave a slow nod, not a salute, but an acknowledgement between warriors who understood each other perfectly. The colonel held his salute for 5 full seconds before lowering his hand. Then he turned to face the assembled crowd of residents and the terrified security guards. His voice took on a formal, declaratory tone, as if delivering testimony before Congress. "For the benefit of those who don't understand what they're witnessing," he began, his voice carrying with parade ground authority, "let me be absolutely clear. You are in the presence of a ghost." Colonel Hartwell's words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The helicopter engines had throttled down to an idle, making his voice clearly audible across the courtyard. "This man," he gestured toward Daniel, "is Master Sergeant Daniel Morrison. He was a founding member of a special operations unit that, for all official purposes, never existed." The colonel's gaze swept across the tactical operators positioned around the lawn. "The men you see here are among the finest soldiers in the world. They are the result of decades of refinement, training, and evolution. But they are merely walking a path that men like Master Sergeant Morrison carved out of the jungle with nothing but courage and blood." He pointed to the rifle on the bench. "That weapon is not just a firearm. It is a relic. One of only 8 original M21 rifles commissioned for Operation Silent Watch. It is a piece of American history more significant than most of the artifacts in our military museums." Brandon had gone pale. He looked like he might be sick. Rick stood frozen, his mind racing through every moment of the last 20 minutes, calculating the magnitude of the disaster they'd created. Colonel Hartwell's expression hardened as he continued. "In 1968, when this nation was locked in a conflict that tore it apart, when young men were dying in rice paddies and mountains they couldn't pronounce, a handful of volunteers stepped forward for a mission that offered no glory, no recognition, and no safety net." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "They were tasked with cross-border operations that were completely deniable. If they were captured, the United States would disavow them. If they were killed, their families would be told they died in training accidents. They had no air support, no extraction teams, no backup." Jennifer Matthews, still on the phone with Major Davis, was openly crying. Through her tears, she heard the Major's voice. "That's why we came so fast, Miss Matthews. There are fewer than a dozen silent watch operators left alive. They are the foundation stones of everything we are. And we will not let them be disrespected." Colonel Hartwell's voice grew quieter but somehow more intense. "Master Sergeant Morrison and his team conducted 73 missions over a 3-year period. They prevented weapons shipments that would have killed hundreds of American soldiers. They extracted intelligence that changed the course of multiple operations. They rescued downed pilots who would have died in enemy prisons." He looked directly at Daniel. "On March 14, 1971, Master Sergeant Morrison's 6-man team was inserted 20 miles inside enemy territory to destroy a supply depot. They were compromised 4 hours into the mission. What followed was a 36-hour running battle through triple canopy jungle. The residents were completely silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. One by one, his teammates fell," the colonel continued, "killed or too wounded to continue. But Master Sergeant Morrison kept moving. He carried the only surviving member of his team, Private First Class Thompson, for 8 miles with a bullet wound in his own leg. When they finally reached the extraction point, Thompson was still alive." Colonel Hartwell's voice cracked slightly. "The rifle Morrison carried that day is the one sitting on this bench. The engraving, 'We walk unseen,' was their motto. Because in the eyes of their country, officially, they were never there. But they were there. And thank God they were." He turned back to Brandon and Rick. His expression shifted from reverence to cold fury. "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "put your hands on a man who has more honor in his smallest finger than you will accumulate in your entire lives." Brandon's legs were shaking. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You grabbed this man's wallet," the colonel continued. "You mocked his service patch. You put your hands on a weapon that represents the blood of 6 men who died, so you could stand here in your pressed uniform and play at authority." Rick found his voice. "Colonel, we didn't know. There's no record of—" "Of course there's no record," the colonel snapped. "That was the entire point. These men operated in the shadows, so the rest of us could stand in the light. They sacrificed recognition so operations could remain classified. They gave up everything, including their own histories." He stepped closer to the 2 guards. "Your company's contract to provide security for this facility is now under immediate review. You can expect multiple calls from my office, from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and from attorneys representing Mr. Morrison's interests." Brandon finally found his voice. "I was just doing my job. The rules say—" "The rules," Colonel Hartwell interrupted, his voice sharp as broken glass, "are meant to be applied with judgment and respect. You applied them with arrogance and cruelty. That is not enforcement. That is abuse of authority." The colonel turned his attention back to Daniel, his demeanor softening instantly. But before he could speak, Daniel raised a hand, a simple gesture that nevertheless stopped the colonel mid-breath. Daniel stood slowly, his movements careful but dignified. He looked at Brandon, whose face had gone from red to ash-white, and then at Rick, who couldn't meet his eyes. "Colonel Hartwell," Daniel said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly. "These young men were doing what they thought was right. The young one has too much vinegar and not enough honey, perhaps. But he's young. We were all young once, full of fire, certain we knew the answers. The grace in that moment was staggering. Daniel's simple act of mercy was more devastating than any condemnation could have been. It highlighted the vast chasm between a boy playing at power and a man who had wielded real power and learned the value of restraint." Brandon's face crumpled. For the first time, the arrogance was completely gone, replaced by something raw and broken. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Daniel said simply. "You saw an old man with a rifle and made assumptions. You saw someone you perceived as powerless and decided to exercise your authority." He paused. "I hope you learn from this. Real strength isn't about making others feel small. It's about lifting others up, even when you have every right not to." Colonel Hartwell watched this exchange with something like wonder on his face. He cleared his throat. "Master Sergeant Morrison is being far more gracious than I would be, but his point is taken." He looked at Brandon. "You have an opportunity here, young man, to learn, to grow. Don't waste it." The colonel gestured to one of his operators who stepped forward carrying a wooden case. The operator opened it, revealing a worn but carefully preserved unit patch under glass, the same insignia that Brandon had mocked from Daniel's wallet. "This patch," the colonel said, "represents Operation Silent Watch. There were 43 men who wore it. 16 died in action. 27 more have died since the war ended. Master Sergeant Morrison is one of only 11 still living." He paused. "And he's the only one still carrying his original weapon." He looked at the rifle on the bench with reverence. "This M21 has a history that would fill a book. It saved Morrison's life twice. He saved others with it 14 times. When the operation was decommissioned in 1973, these rifles were supposed to be destroyed. But a captain with more heart than fear smuggled 8 of them out and returned them to their operators." Daniel's gaze drifted to the rifle, and for a moment, the courtyard dissolved. He wasn't 83 years old sitting on a stone bench. He was 28, standing in a sweltering Quonset hut in a place that didn't exist on any map. Captain Miller, a man with the eyes of an eagle and scars that told stories he'd never speak, had pressed this rifle into his hands. "This is yours now, Morrison," the captain had said, his voice like gravel. "There's only 8 of them. They'll never show up on any inventory. The engraving is for the few who know. We walk unseen. That's our legacy. If you're captured, if you're killed, officially you were never there. But you were there, and I'll never forget. The memory faded. Daniel blinked, and the warm afternoon sun replaced the oppressive heat of the hut. The colonel was still talking, but Daniel had missed a few sentences. Which is why, Colonel Hartwell was saying, we treat every silent watch operator as a protected asset. When Major Davis received Miss Matthews's call and heard the designation, every alarm in our command structure went off. He looked at Jennifer, who stood near the landscaping wall, phone still clutched in her hand. Miss Matthews, would you come here, please? Jennifer approached hesitantly, intimidated by the ring of tactical operators and the sheer weight of authority. The colonel extended his hand. Thank you, he said simply. You did exactly the right thing. Your father would be proud. Jennifer's eyes welled up. My dad always said to stand up for veterans. Always. He taught you well. The colonel turned back to address the full assembly. What happened here today is a perfect illustration of why veteran advocacy matters, why we can never assume we know someone's story just by looking at them. He picked up the rifle from the bench with careful, reverent hands. This weapon is now going to be properly documented and preserved. Master Sergeant Morrison, with your permission, we'd like to display it at the Special Forces Museum at Fort Liberty. Your story deserves to be told. Daniel shook his head slowly. That rifle stays with me, Colonel. It's carried me through 60 years. I'll carry it a bit longer. Colonel Hartwell nodded, understanding immediately. He carefully returned the weapon to Daniel's hands. Of course, Master Sergeant, of course. The helicopters remained on the lawn, engines idling, while Colonel Hartwell spent the next 20 minutes speaking with facility administrators who had rushed out in a panic. The director, a nervous woman named Susan Chen, kept apologizing profusely. The colonel was polite but firm. The facility would implement immediate veteran sensitivity training, review all security protocols, and establish a direct line to the Veterans Affairs Liaison Office. Brandon and Rick were escorted off the property by two of the tactical operators. Not arrested, just removed. Their supervisor would arrive within the hour to conduct a full investigation. Mrs. Walsh approached Daniel cautiously once the official conversations had concluded. Daniel, she said, her voice trembling, I've known you for 3 years. You never said a word about any of this. Daniel smiled gently. Wasn't supposed to say words about it, Eleanor. That was the point. We walked unseen. He paused. Besides, it was a long time ago. I'm just an old man now, trying to keep his rifle from rusting. You're not just anything, Mr. Rivera interjected, joining them. You're a hero. Daniel's expression shifted, something painful flickering across his face. The heroes didn't come home, Thomas. I'm just the one who kept walking. Colonel Hartwell overheard this exchange. He stepped closer, his voice low enough that only the small group could hear. Master Sergeant, I've read the classified files. I know about Thompson. I know what you carried him through. I know what you sacrificed. He paused. You kept walking because that's what heroes do. They keep walking when no one's watching, when there's no medal waiting, when the only reward is knowing you did what had to be done. Daniel's eyes glistened, but he didn't reply. Some things were too deep for words. Jennifer approached, hesitant. Mr. Morrison? I'm sorry I called the military without asking you first. I couldn't watch them treat you that way. Daniel turned to her, and his expression softened completely. You did exactly right, young lady. Your father taught you well. What's his name? Maybe I knew him. Captain James Matthews. He served in Afghanistan, 2007 to 2009. Daniel nodded slowly. Different war, different time, but the same spirit. Tell your father I'm grateful for his service, and I'm grateful he raised a daughter who stands up for what's right. Jennifer wiped her eyes. I will, sir. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the tactical team began their extraction procedures. The operators moved with the same fluid efficiency, reeling in ropes, conducting equipment checks. Colonel Hartwell extended his hand to Daniel. Master Sergeant, my card. That's my direct line, day or night. If you need anything, medical care, Legal assistance, or just someone to talk to who understands? You call me. That's an order. Daniel took the card, a small smile playing at his lips. Haven't taken orders in a long time, Colonel. Then consider it a respectful request from a grateful nation. The Colonel's voice was thick with emotion. Sir, I mean this with every fiber of my being. It has been the honor of my career to meet you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for your grace today. They shook hands, and in that grip was an entire conversation. Acknowledgement, respect, understanding. The Colonel saluted one final time, then strode back to his helicopter. The aircraft lifted off simultaneously, their rotor wash creating one last windstorm before they banked away and disappeared over the tree line. The courtyard slowly returned to its usual quiet, but nothing would ever be quite the same. The residents gathered around Daniel, not pressing too close but forming a protective circle. They had questions, dozens of them, but they had the wisdom to understand that some stories couldn't be told. Some histories were too classified, too painful, too sacred. Well, Daniel said finally, picking up his cleaning cloth, I suppose I should finish what I started. Mrs. Walsh laughed, a sound filled with relief and affection. Daniel Morrison, you finished that rifle maintenance. And then you're coming to dinner with Thomas and me. No arguments. Wouldn't dream of arguing, Eleanor. As he resumed his careful work, drawing the cloth along the barrel with the same steady precision he'd shown an hour ago, the other residents slowly dispersed, but they kept glancing back, seeing him differently now. Not as the quiet man in 3G, as the warrior who had walked unseen so they could live in peace. 6 weeks later, Brandon Cole stood outside a small diner in downtown Fayetteville. He'd been fired from the security company 3 days after the incident. The video had gone viral. Someone had recorded the helicopter arrival on their phone. The internet had been merciless. But Colonel Hartwell had also been merciful. He'd arranged for Brandon to attend a week-long veteran advocacy training course. He'd connected him with a therapist who specialized in helping people process humiliation and learn from mistakes. He'd even written a letter to potential employers explaining the incident and Brandon's subsequent growth. Brandon had spent those 6 weeks working construction, thinking constantly about Daniel Morrison's face when he'd shown grace instead of condemnation. He'd written 17 drafts of an apology letter. None of them felt adequate. Through the diner window, he could see Daniel sitting in a booth, coffee steaming in front of him. Brandon had called ahead. One of the residents at Meadowbrook had given him Daniel's number and permission to reach out. His hands were shaking as he pushed open the door. The bell jingled. Daniel looked up, recognition flickering across his face. Brandon walked to the booth. He pulled out a folded check from his pocket, his first paycheck from the construction job. Sir, this is for you. For your time, for my disrespect, for everything. Daniel glanced at the check and pushed it back across the table. Keep your money, son. Sit down. Tell me about yourself. Brandon hesitated, then slowly slid into the booth. I don't deserve your time. Maybe not, Daniel agreed. But you're getting it anyway, that's what grace is. Now you want coffee? As they talked, awkwardly at first, then with growing ease, the morning sun streamed through the window. Two men separated by 55 years and an ocean of experience finding common ground in the simple act of conversation. The quietest heroes often carry the heaviest history. Their valor isn't found in shouted words or polished medals, but in the silent dignity with which they live and forgive. To everyone who typed honor and shared where you're watching from, thank you for standing with our heroes. Subscribe for more stories like this and unsung American heroes. See you in the next one.